It's Christmas. Okay, not quite. But I'm sure anyone that does celebrate the holiday, well, by now you probably have your tree up. Letters will be on their way to Santa. And if you're anything like me, the big box of sweets will already be half eaten. Now, whether you believe in the whole religious side of Christmas or not, I think the one thing that we could all agree on is that in the true spirit of the season, well, it is a time for giving to those less fortunate than ourselves. And with that in mind, I've decided to support a local charity, Cash for Kids NI. It's their goal this December to try and ensure that no child has to wake up Christmas morning without a present under the tree. For my part, what I want to do is build a vintage system. This one, Compaq ProLinea 425S. We're going to stick a few upgrades in it, these things. Then we'll put it on eBay, and whatever it sells for, I'll round that up to the nearest few pound, and we'll donate that to the charity. We'll come back to these upgrades, because to start with, I just want to take a look at the machine in its basic configuration. Plus there's a bit of a story to this sound card. I'll tell you that later. So the Compaq ProLinea 425S, well, that probably gives away the specification of this machine. 486, 25 megahertz, and yes, it is the SX variety. The case is incredibly dirty, isn't it? I'm going to strip the whole thing down so I can give it a really good clean. But before that, and as usual, let's just take a look around the outside to see what sort of features this thing has. Well, on the front, you get your two LEDs for power and hard drive activity. We've got 3.5-inch floppy drive, 1.44 megabytes, and below that is a spare 5.25-inch bay. That's where we're going to stick the CD drive. The power switch lives on the front here, and it is a somewhat satisfying, clunky affair. On the back then, it just goes to confirm how basic this machine actually is. There is room for some expansion, although there's no expansion cards to be seen. On board we have VGA and your typical parallel to serial and PS2 for mouse and keyboard. The power supply lives in here, and Compaq were very kind to point out which screws we need to remove to get into the case. Somewhat unkindly though, well, it's not your typical Phillips head, rather it's a Torx bit, and in particular a T15. Inside then, we get a look at the motherboard. There's its 486 SX 25 MHz CPU. But sitting beside that is a nice socket into which we can fit an upgraded processor. But as I said, more on the upgrades later. Down here we have our VGA display adapter from Sing Labs. It looks like it has 1 megabyte of RAM associated with that. Interesting chip there. That's labelled music. There's certainly no sound capabilities on this motherboard. I'll have to look up that part number. MU9C9760F. If I had to guess though, I would say it's probably a DAC. I think that's our BIOS chip right there. And obviously you can see the 3 ISA slots for expansion. You'll not be able to see too much in here until I strip the thing down. But there was a battery in there which I have already replaced with a double AA battery holder. And I only did that because originally I was going to keep this machine in the collection. But since we're now going to move it on, I'm going to replace that again, and we'll swap that out for a coin cell holder, and we'll stick a 3V CR2032 in there instead of those. Power supply is just to your typical AT standard. and you can just about see the hard drive, which is installed upside down for some reason, and the floppy drive. On top of which, Compaq have very kindly installed this label, which tells us all about the jumpers on the board and how to set them for various different configurations. I keep saying we'll come back to the upgrades, but we're also going to have to come back to this, because this section in particular, well, it tells us how to upgrade that processor. I've stripped everything down. That's the drives and riser cards sitting over there. And this here is the motherboard. So you can now more clearly see this section here that was hiding in behind the riser card previously. And there's our AT power connector. We have onboard floppy and IDE. And space for 4 72-pin SIMs. But no SIMs to be seen. Rather, this machine has 4 megabytes of onboard memory, and that's them sitting there. I just went ahead and cut the wires that I had installed running to my AA battery holder. And while taking this out, I actually noticed this pin header here. Well, that's for an external battery. So I think what we'll do is make off cables to one of my coin cell battery holders. I'll just mount that battery holder to the side of the power supply the way it was done before, and we'll just connect the cables off to this rather than hardwiring the thing onto the motherboard as I had done here. But yes, of course, I will remove those 2 wires and clean up around where I had soldered them in originally. There's a date of 1993 on the board here. However, having a look around the various chips, well, the main chipset and the Singlabs display adapter, both of those are dated January of 94. And our board was made in Scotland. I've made up this cable with the CR2032 battery holder on it. I'll go in there like that. On this end, I've stuck a wee 4-way connector, but one of the pins on this is blanked off. That's just to match what's on the motherboard. The orange wire in this instance is the positive. That goes on like that. And with that one blanked off, well, it just means you can never reconnect it incorrectly. So what I want to do is just boot the machine here. We can set up the BIOS and run a benchmark just to see what its performance is like in its stock offering. And yes, we're doing it on the bench here because I've also given the case a bit of a wash and it's currently drying. So system posts, and as you would expect, system options are not set up because we didn't have the battery. F10, English. The date is the 10th of December. Oh, month first. This is an American BIOS. And it's 2021. And the time is currently about 8:30. Disk drive A, 1.44 megabytes. We don't have disk drive B. I see it has already detected our hard drive. Type 65, 125 megabytes, that is correct. So, F3 to exit, save changes. Now that hard drive is already set up with DOS 6.22 on it. So, all things being well, it should just boot straight into that. And away it goes. So I've got a floppy disk in there. If we just go into that, there's a couple of tools that we can run. Let's check the CPU. So yeah, classic 46, 25 megahertz. I thought we would also check the cache as well. And this board, unfortunately, only has the 8K cache on the processor. Plus, I don't see anywhere that you could possibly even add L2 cache. So that is going to limit the potential performance of this system. Although, when we add a bit more system memory and upgrade the CPU anyway, well, still going to be a decent enough wee rig. Then we can run sysinfo. No, not that one, Amiga fans. Norton sysinfo for DOS. And this confirms it is a Compaq computer, 46SX25. Now, if we go into the benchmarks, take a look at the CPU speed, 54.1. So here's a thought. SX25. Well, you see this jumper here? If I move that from there to there, that's changing the front side bus from 25 to 33 megahertz. Will that make this an SX33? I need to make that change anyway for the CPU that's going to go in here eventually. But curiosity, I want to know if this will work. Well, system posts. It's counted up, it's 4 megabytes of onboard RAM, that stuff. It seems to be booting. If we check CPU again, will it show it as 33 megahertz? And yes, it does. What about sysinfo? Just how much faster will it benchmark? So again, that confirms 46SX33. And yeah, that is quite the increase in performance, isn't it? 71.8 now, bringing us up in line there with the Intel 46DX33. Obviously, this CPU test is not looking for the FPU. Well, that's a very quick, cheap, and easy performance boost for one of these machines, isn't it? Just switch that jumper over. How about we start throwing a couple of upgrades at this board? I think we'll start with the memory. Now, as I understand anyway, this board can support a maximum of 32 megabytes of RAM. There's 4 on here, and if you notice there, it says on the silk screen 4 megabyte SIM only, pointing to that SIM socket. But what we're going to be adding anyway is 4 meg in there and another 4 megabytes in there. That gives us a total then of 12, which is a decent number for a 486 rig. And it also leaves 2 free slots there so that the prospective buyer of this system, well, they can push that memory out a bit further. Should they wish, they could stick another couple of 4 megabyte SIMs in, or even a couple of 8 megabyte SIMs. But 12, as I say, that's loads for a system like this. And then we can just give it a quick test, just to make sure it's going to post and count up the full 12 megabytes. Yeah, well, it starts up, counting past 4, counting past 8, and 12. Memory size error? I wasn't expecting that. F10, okay. The following configuration options were updated automatically, the memory. And I'm trusting this time it will just go ahead and boot. Yeah, away it goes. And if we just check sysinfo again quickly. Yeah, there we are. DOS memory, that's the 640. And the extended memory, that is the rest of the 12 megabytes. Still running at 33 megahertz. Okay, we're not doing an awful lot here, but it does seem to be stable for what we have done running at that speed. You know what, actually? I have a little demo on the hard drive. And how about we just run that for a couple of minutes? Just to see if the machine is indeed stable with that chip overclocked to 33. Okay, it's been running for a few minutes. The chip is certainly getting hot. Almost too hot to touch. But it seems to be running fine. And at least, if anything, there's certain sections of this little demo here that, well, when we get the upgraded CPU in there, we can compare just to see how much faster it is. And speaking of which, I suppose that is the next thing we should really do. Because while the 46SX, now at 33 MHz, is a decent enough chip, what you really want in here is a 46DX. We'll stick with the 33 MHz frontside bus, but we'll go with a DX2, so that's the 66. And that is this thing here, complete with its little heatsink. This sort of arrangement will be perfect for fitting into a socket like that. It's ST DX266, heatsink required. Yes, this is another Cyrix chip. That's all we seem to ever have here on this channel, isn't it? Cyrix processors. But they're 486 CPUs. They're not that bad. They do perform very, very similar to the Intel counterpart. So while, yes, I know people do turn their nose up at Cyrix when it comes to the Pentium generation, back here in the 486 time, their chips were not that bad. So here's the first question. What orientation is correct for this chip? Because the 486 generation of CPUs, well, the socket is not keyed. You know, the pins are even the whole way around the thing. So you can put it in any direction. Now you may think, well, that chip is facing that way, so this one is bound to go in like that. But the big dot and the chamfered edge there, well, that denotes pin 1 down here. And if we look on the board, there's a 1 there, pin 1. But you can also just about make out the outline of a chip on the silk screen, and that corner is also chamfered. So down there is pin 1. That chip needs to go in like that. And I do hope that's right, because I don't have the tool to get those back out again. That type of socket, you need a tool to lift the chip out. I don't have one. It's in the right orientation. I'm 100% maybe sure it's in the right orientation. So the next thing we have to do then is set the jumpers. Now this one down here is already set to the 33 MHz frontside bus, so we can leave that alone. These ones though, these configure what type of CPU is installed. So if we pull up that label that was over the top of the floppy drive, you can see there processor configuration. So for 46, DX, DX2 or SX2, pins 9, 10 and 11, well, pin 9 needs to be set to position 1, 2, which it is. Pin 10 needs to go to position 2, 3. And pin 11 needs to come up to position 1, 2. Those are really tall pins on pin 11, aren't they? But processor disable if primary processor is not socketed, that one. Place jumper at P7 over pins 2, 3 when installing upgrade processor. So that's currently on 1, 2, that needs to go to there. I'm not happy with that. That's not making contact with the top of the chip because it's dancing about. So the heatsink is going to be completely pointless. While it's not required, what I'm going to do is put a bit of thermal compound on that, just to take up that gap between the top of the CPU and the bottom of the heatsink. I can guarantee you this is the only 486 in the world with Arctic MX4 on it. It's still rattling about a bit, but that compound will just take up the gap between the top of the processor and the heatsink to allow the heatsink to do its job. Right, let's give it the smoke test. That initial pause from when you flick the switch to the machine coming up, that's enough to scare the life out of anyone. But it has came up. Co-processor has been detected. Wants us to run that setup again. F10. The following configuration options were automatically updated. Numeric co-processor. Now that is very interesting because the BIOS is thinking that that is just an FPU. But we know better. It's a replacement processor. We're going from a 486SX to a 486DX2. So this time around I would expect it just to boot. Yep. And if we run check CPU again, it is correctly identifying that our chip is now the Cyrix DX2 and its internal clock is 66. That's what the 2 stands for in DX2. That's the clock multiplier. Bus speed is 33 multiplied by 2. That gives us the CPU clock. What about sysinfo? What sort of performance will we be seeing now? And yes, another pretty impressive jump in performance. We're now up to 112.45. It's floating between those two. And despite being 66 megahertz, you can see that it is pretty much only halfway to the performance of the Intel Pentium 66. But I'm really happy with that. So we've got our new CPU in there. That one is now stone cold. It's doing nothing. In fact, you could remove that from that board, most likely, and it wouldn't have any effect on the thing. We're not going to do that though, we'll just leave it. I suppose the next thing we're going to have to do is rebuild this system into the case. Because the next upgrade is going to be the sound card. And for that I need the riser card in there. So let me reassemble the machine and then we'll take a look at this thing. Everything's back in the case. We're going to get the sound card installed. I've also put the CD drive in there, although we have a bit of a major problem with that, which I'll come to. The sound card though, Creative Sound Blaster 16 with the Vibra chipset. This is a CT2890. And as I said, there is a bit of a story behind this card. I picked this up from eBay. I don't know, could be 4 or 5 months ago now. And it was one of those cards that you sometimes see listed being sold for scrap gold. You know, being sold to people who scrap them, take those contacts off, all the pins off, and try to recover the gold. But when I seen this for only 99p, I thought to myself, that might make an interesting video. So I bought it with the full intention of looking over the card, fixing whatever was faulty with it. I just assumed it was faulty. And yeah, I thought that's a good video in the making. But when I got this thing, tested it, it works fine. So I never bothered doing anything with it until now. One thing that was missing was the bracket, so I've just 3D printed this one. And the card is going to go into the top slot. Just like that. Have to be careful not to over tighten that, because that is just plastic after all. So the CD drive, yeah, problems. And it was all going so smoothly, wasn't it? All the other upgrades went in with no trouble whatsoever. The CD drive though, well, unfortunately the case is missing what must be like a caddy to carry this thing. That would screw in there, and there's another screw on the other side. So I'm going to have to go back to the 3D printer, because without that, there's nothing to screw this thing to. I've taken a couple of very sketchy notes. I'm going to go and print something to hold that. But we have another problem as well. The CD drive is going to have to sit in behind the case. Because this opening here, the drive doesn't fit through it. So it's going to have to sit up against the back lip of that. What were you thinking, Compaq? Why does a standard 5 1/4 inch drive not fit through that? But it is what it is. So I'm going to go and print something to suit this. And then it'll just be a matter of installing some software and the machine is finished. You know, things are rarely ever as simple as you think. And this thing is certainly a good example of that. Took quite a bit longer than I was expecting to get this right. And with 5 hours to print that, well, let's just say this is the 3rd time round. But it's done now. So let's get it onto the drive. It's a nice tight fit on there. That should line up nicely with the holes. There we are. Right, that's that on there now. And I've designed this in such a way that you see these 2 rails down here. Well, these get slightly thicker down in there. So the back of the drive will sit on those. And that hopefully will hold our CD drive in there now nice and securely. I'm going to hook up the cables and then we'll try and fit the case. And so hopefully this fits. And that's just the way it's going to have to look. The CD drive sits up against the back of that lip. Doesn't look too bad. Seems as if the drive has been pushed in, but it's just the way it has to be. Now, in terms of software to put on this machine, well, I was very nearly going to leave it with DOS 6.22 on there, and I was even considering installing a copy of Windows 3.11. But to be perfectly honest with you, I wouldn't have a spare license to ship with the machine with those operating systems. So instead of doing that, what I've decided to do is just install FreeDOS on this. And for games, well, I've just stuck a copy of the Doom shareware version on the hard drive as well. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Believe it or not, this machine is actually my first time using FreeDOS. Now there is a bit of a learning curve to it compared to just Microsoft DOS, but it's more or less the same thing. Its memory management is very impressive though. As you can see there, we have quite a bit of memory available, under 1 megabyte, a whole 779K. As I said, Doom is the only game installed at the minute. And it is just the shareware version. But it's an absolute classic, and it will certainly get you started with some vintage PC gaming. I've also stuck just a couple of benchmarks on the hard drive. So you've got 3D bench, check CPU and sysinfo. And as you can see there in 3D bench 2, well, the system is certainly fast enough, despite the fact that it doesn't have any L2 cache, and that graphics adapter, well, it's just sitting on the ISA bus, not VLB like some of our other 486 systems. But got to 40 frames a second there. That is certainly not to be sniffed at. And then just to point it out, just so that everything is above board, there is one minor defect with the case, and it's right there. There is a crack in that front cover. Now I have put a bit of epoxy on the back of that, so hopefully it doesn't get any worse. But there's a little crack there that you can certainly catch your nail on it. Around the case there is the odd scratch and little nick out of the paintwork, but come on, it's the guts of 30 years old. I think it's in really good condition. So there's just one other thing that I think this case needs, just to finish it off. Nice CRG case badge. Did I put that on straight? Well, that's it. The wee system is finished. It's currently on eBay. The auction is live. Links in the description below. I've started it just at 99p, no reserve, and hopefully we can raise quite a bit of money for the charity. And should you be watching this video and perhaps win this machine, if you're interested, let me know, and I'll even throw in a mug. Or perhaps you're not interested in the machine whatsoever and would still like to donate some money to the charity. Well, I've left a link in the description below to my page within there, and you can donate directly on that. Now, this is the part of the video where I would normally ask for your like and your subscription, but I'm not doing that this time. Rather, all I would ask is that you maybe share the eBay page and the charity page with anyone who might be interested in this machine, or indeed interested in donating to Cash for Kids NI. Well, that is it for now. Here's hoping that we can raise a decent amount of money. I will, of course, update everyone on how it goes, and until then, I'll see you next time.